may find that special, just that one quote that finally ties a myriad of little stories together. And I've experienced that with Dr. Jung. He's actually shown me how families are connected. The Chinese families are connected in the Delta. And just getting to work with Dr. Jung over the past couple of years, pulling out special pieces of history, special quotes from our oral history collection for one of his books, has really been exciting. And he's so gentle with this history and very compassionate. And he's really one of those folks that I really enjoy working with. And I hope that you all can recognize what he has done for the Delta's Chinese history, putting it in front of so many more people than we could possibly do just by putting collections online and processing them. He's made them accessible through his books, and really given us a whole new audience to preach to. Dr. Jung, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, and then following Dr. Jung is Adrienne Millard. She's our writer in residence here at Boston. We've gotten her to come down on a grant from the Humanities Council. We're glad for that. And Adrienne will follow up Dr. Jung's presentation with one of her own. Kind of, it blends. Believe me, it'll work. Thank you. Dr. Jung?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really privileged and honored to be able to come down and be part of this celebration. It's kind of interesting to give you a little background about how I even got involved with this, because when I first started this, I'd actually never been in Mississippi. And very often when I go around the country giving talks about chopsticks in the land of cotton, people say, "Oh, did you live in Mississippi, or did you have a grocery store?" And I say no, and they kind of say, well, how do you know so much about this? So in a way, it's really kind of a bizarre story, and I'll share part of that with you. This morning, first of all, I just want to say, it's really great to be here. Actually, it's reflections and reunion, but actually we can think of it as 3 R's. But not these particular ones that we're familiar with that saying, but we know that there are reflections that you've been sharing all weekend, and it's in this wonderful reunion. I've eavesdropped on conversations that people talk about, oh, I haven't seen so-and-so in 50 years and so forth, and that just seemed to be running all through the meetings and so forth. And yet I somehow thought that a lot of the people would really know each other much more frequently, but it is true that people went in so many different directions that this is just a fantastic opportunity for all of you guys to get reunited. And then I also noticed that everyone's been having a good time and chatting and making new friends, and so I'm really happy to be part of this. So let me give you a little bit of background about myself in case you don't know already. My parents came from Guangdong. They settled in Macon, Georgia, not in Mississippi, obviously. And we were had a laundry, and our family, we were the only Chinese in the city. The nearest Chinese were probably 100 miles away. So when I was 15, my family moved us to San Francisco, which was a whole different world, and took a lot of adjustments. And then I went on and got a degree in psychology, and I've been teaching psychology until I retired. And when I retired, I suddenly reflected on what my parents' life had been, and also that of myself and my siblings. And I wrote a memoir called Southern Fried Rice as a tribute to my parents. And not knowing how well it would be received, I'm not a historian, I'm really just kind of a writer and a person who just had some observations. So what happened was I went and gave a talk about this book, Southern Fried Rice, in Los Angeles at the Historical Society in 2007. And surprisingly, at the end, a gentleman stood up and said, "What do you know about Chinese Mississippi?" So I said, well, I've read a book. I don't know a whole lot about it, and actually maybe know one person from college who's from Mississippi. And so Roland Chow, who some of you may know, the late Roland Chow, who was a very good friend of mine and who passed away early this year, was at the meeting, and he stood up and said, well, why don't you write a book about Mississippi Chinese? And I kind of thought to myself, he's got to be kidding. I don't know anything about Mississippi Chinese. I can't write a book about them. And so he said, well, I know a lot of people, and I'll give you their phone numbers, and call Carolyn Chan, and talk to her, and call, these other people. And so after a while, I kind of thought about it. That's a picture of Roland and I in LA a couple of years ago. Southern Fried Rice actually kind of was my calling card because it sort of established an introduction and rapport. Frida Kwan felt that that I could understand Chinese in the South, even though I didn't come from Mississippi, and she sort of vouched for me. Frida, as we know, is quite prodigious at rounding up people. She is like a little Energizer bunny, and she keeps this thing going. And so I want to acknowledge all the things that she's done to make this possible today. So anyway, going ahead to talk about how I decided whether to write about this. I read these two books that are very good books and introductions to the earlier history. These came out in like 1970s and 1980s. It's interesting, I'd asked a lot of people, who is this Robert Cito Kwan? I wanted to meet him, I wanted to interview him. I talked to James Lowen, but I could never find this Robert Louis Cito. No one seemed to know where he was. I searched on Google, I couldn't find him. He just left without a trace. And I was, just a couple of months ago, I was at a talk, and I was talking to a woman, and she said, oh, my ex-husband wrote a book about Mississippi Chinese. I said, Eureka, I have found Mrs. Robert Cito Kwan once removed. So, it's kind of amazing. I run into these kind of little incidents every so often, so I just thought I'd share that with you, that those of you who knew him when he was a student down here, he's somewhere in LA. I think he's selling real estate or something. Okay, so I read the oral histories that are in the archives here at Delta State, and I found them very informative and taught me a lot about what life was like in the Delta, things that I knew nothing about firsthand. So there's a list of the names of the people who were in those earlier set of archives, oral histories, not the ones that were collected this year, which were too late for me, because I finished my book by the end of 2008. So after I read those, I thought to myself, yeah, even though I don't know much about this community, I'm willing to learn. And I think the story was so unique that it needed to be preserved, it needed to be recorded before it was too late. So the other stuff that I'd read in the earlier books kind of answers these kinds of questions: who, where, when, what, why, those kinds of questions that we all ask when we want to do research. But what intrigued me most was sort of questions about how did the Chinese move around the country before they came to the Delta. They didn't just come straight from China to the Delta. Although that was kind of a model I was thinking of, because my parents, when they came pretty much straight to Georgia because they knew people there, and they didn't go back and forth and back and forth. And then later, as I learned about other people's histories, I could see that other people's histories were much more complicated than that of my parents. So what I wanted to do was basically look at how these people got to the Delta, why they got into the grocery business, and then how do they maintain their Chinese culture when they were such a small minority in a land of, black and white. And facing prejudice, how would they deal with these things? So before I got into that, the first thing that I noticed, because you have to remember, I came from a laundry background, and I had written a book about Chinese laundries all across America. So first thing I look for when I go anywhere is, where's the laundry, okay? So I came to the Mississippi stuff, and I couldn't find anybody who had a laundry. And I thought that was bizarre, because you go everywhere in the United States, before 1950, and even later, there were Chinese laundries. But there were none in Mississippi that I could find. Everybody I talked to said, no, we never had any Chinese laundries. So why was that the case? Turns out, actually, that was not true. They did have laundries in the Delta before you guys were born. In fact, I looked in the census records, and I found, you won't be able to read these names, but there's, in 1880 in Greenville, there was a laundryman, okay? In 1910, there was a laundry. Years one, let's see what year is this, 1880 in Greenville. Charlie Fung or somebody. Okay, you may not know these people, but here's evidence there were laundries. In fact, these people, were no longer around to interview or anything. But one day, I get this email, and the email says, I was interested in your Chinese groceries in the Delta book that was coming out. This was like about 6 years ago in the fall of 2008. And she wanted to give this book to her father for Christmas. And Pam's here somewhere, because I met her for the first time. So she sent this email to me, and I had just been down here. That was my first time to the Delta. So I was really intrigued by this because she also told me some other stuff in her email. My father grew up in Greenville in the 20s and 40s. His mother originally had a laundry and then a grocery store. And when I saw that, I saw red, I saw red. And so if he was interested in my book, I was interested in knowing about his stories about the laundry. So we exchanged emails, and I learned some about the early history of this woman who ran the laundry. It wasn't a laundry man, it was a laundry woman. She was running this laundry down by the levee on Walnut Street in Greenville. And then, so there's even the census record showing where the laundry was. The Hop Lee Laundry at 120 Walnut Street. So this made it really concrete. Plus, I was actually talking to descendants and her father who had actually, been in that family. So he remembered being in the laundry in 1927 when it was flooded. They left the laundry business and went. So that could have almost been like one of the last laundries in the Delta. And she saw that, hey, running grocery store is easier than running a laundry. So that's why she got out of the laundry. All right, so that's a bit of history there. Okay, so what I was interested in, and I'm going to show you 3 diagrams, 3 or 4 diagrams that if you've read Chopsticks in the Land of Cotton, these diagrams will be a little familiar, and I'll show you a few other diagrams that sort of map out how some families' history involved going to many places in the United States. Now, this one is a simplified diagram. I'm going to show you a more complicated one in a way. We have 2 families here. We have a red line and we have a blue line. And we have the red line coming from Massachusetts, Holyoke, Massachusetts, and coming down to the Delta eventually. I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but just to give you an overview. Then we have another family in Portland, and Portland goes to Fargo, and then Fargo goes to Shelby, and then, so this is a family that some of you may recognize. In fact, the principal people who gave me this information a year, I didn't tell them I was going to talk about them, so hopefully it's okay. But this was a striking illustration for me of how this family that ran a laundry in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and there were 3 brothers there, and they hear that there's a grocery store for sale. Somebody from their village in Greenville, Joe Gao is going to leave and go back to China or something. So they decide that, we don't want to do this laundry anymore. So 2 of the guys go down to Greenville, check it out. They leave one guy behind, Joe Guai. He stays behind for a while, and then I guess he joins them. And then they bring over a lot of relatives, cousins, maybe brothers or whatever, and they all open stores and have a partnership and so forth, which is so instrumental in their financial success and also in maintaining the family ties and the cultural traditions and so forth. And so meanwhile, over on Oregon, Wong Ong He's I think, the father of Paul Wong, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so there are other relatives over in Fargo, so they get into the restaurant business there, and then Mei Wong Chow goes down to Shelby and marries, was it Jack Chow? Oh, okay, I know I got some of these garbled, but that's why I figure you guys will correct me. Forgive me my slight mistakes, but because all you Joes and Chows got me totally confused in doing this, and if it wasn't for Bobby Joe Moon helping straighten me out, I would have really been in a mess. So anyway, and then Paul Wong eventually comes down, and meanwhile on the other side, Joe Guy's son, Joe Jung, goes to China. He actually got a master's degree in civil engineering from MIT, which was amazing. You know, when I saw that, I really couldn't believe it. It was a fantastic find there. And then so he comes back and opens a store in Chula, and his daughter, Helen, marries Paul. Okay, so we have this long distance, all around the world connection, you know, and it's really fantastic. And I'm so happy that Paul and Helen were able to come to this, because they were really helpful in giving me a lot of information too. And in fact, it's kind of an interesting anecdote how I even learned all this. I'm sitting in their house in Palos Verdes talking with them, and I'm talking to Paul, and I'm speculating, how come there weren't any laundries in the Delta or something? And then Helen happens to walk by the room and overhears this, and she says, oh yeah, there were Chinese who had laundries. They were up in Massachusetts. And then so she gives me this whole story, and I said, wow, this is just unreal. You know, there's nuggets of gold here. So this is why it's kind of exciting to do this kind of work. My other books dealt with people who were all long gone, so I couldn't even talk to them. But yeah, every day I was finding out something new. All right, so, and here's some, you know, a summary of some of the people who were in the Zhou Gao Niu store from a census record. So there's an old picture of where Zhou Gao Niu would be, right down here on the corner of, at the levee at the end of Washington Street. And you're probably more familiar with this classic image that was sort of an iconic picture. It's probably my favorite picture of the you know, grocery stores, because it shows it's a communal center. It's a hangout. It's sort of like before there were Starbucks. You know, this is where you hung out by the Coca-Cola bench. Okay, so as I said, you know, families were really important connections, and this is certainly true in the case of the Boyle people, the Moons and the Joes and let's see, Pangs. What's the one other family there? Okay, yeah, Gongs. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, okay. So we can see that everyone's bringing all their relatives in, and you know, so this creates a community around Boyle, and I'm not going to take the time to show you all the diagrams, but you can see some of the names of how all these people are related to each other, and how one brings in another, and then you have, eventually you have families develop and grow, and this is the foundation of the Delta community. Also, I met a guy in San Diego, I was giving a talk, and Henry Wong. Now, he doesn't come from the Delta, but his sister, Nellie Wong, settled, married into Round Pound, Arkansas. And then they had relatives who were over in Marvell and Forest City. And so you can see how these people were not always in a grocery business. A lot of them were in restaurant work. They were in Mexico, Traverse City, Michigan, Durango, Colorado, vegetable farmers. One guy was a waiter in a restaurant in Chicago, so, and people from Detroit. So all these people somehow found their way down to the Delta after sort of working in other parts of the country. So I think that needs to be understood, that, you know, how they got there was not a direct path. It was a really kind of a circuitous route in many ways. And then we have even from Cuba, okay, people from China went to Cuba, then New York, then St. Louis, and then end up in Greenville in the grocery store. And so the Jung grocery store, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, was the result of that migration. Then I got an email, I think last year, from someone, because after a while, people become familiar with the book or other stuff that I posted. So they either ask me questions or tell me stuff. So this is just a simplified thing of Jim Fung was the father. He came over. He had several great uncles come before the 1920s. They also started in the laundry business in Michigan, in a town I've never heard of, Escanaba. I don't know if any of you are from Michigan and would know where that is. But anyway, they eventually ended up with a store in Benoit, and then opened Jim's Market in Greenville. So you can see laundries do have a connection with groceries business. Now that we have the internet as a powerful resource, I've started trying to figure out how we can utilize it better. And I'll give you a few examples. I got an email from someone saying, can you help me find some of my ancestors? Well, I like a challenge, but sometimes not easy, but I give it the old college try, but so he gave me this story, they said, something you had written, they're blaming me for this now, something you had written matched something I read from my grandfather's files. The grocery store my grandfather owned burned down in 1914. I hope you can help me find out whether there was a store. Well, I actually was unable to do this. And I couldn't find anyone who was around from 1914 who could help me either. But it's still interesting to see, the connections of where the families moved to and how they ended up in Greenville and then Shelby and New York. This guy really went around. The grandfather was in Clarksdale, Austin, China. This is in chronological order. New York, Baltimore, Shelby, Memphis, Canton, Mississippi, and then eventually goes to Seattle. So without the internet and, this more rapid communication, this sort of information probably wouldn't reach me. So what I started doing was say, now I know a lot of you don't use Facebook, but at least you know more or less what it is. It can be used for a lot of different purposes, but what I tried to do was create a Facebook page for the Mississippi Delta Chinese. And initially it was kind of slow going because people weren't familiar with it and older generation is not into that sort of stuff. But gradually various people started making postings and I would find things of interest that I thought would be interesting to people in the Delta and I would post it. And so it started getting some momentum. Like right now we have so-called 379 members, whatever that means, members, but there's some people who never contribute, but there are people who like to read about it and sometimes post stuff. So some of the things that people post are, just being in contact with each other, but some of it's also kind of really powerful. And I'll give you an example. One day, Linda Gatewood Bassey posted this picture of the Rosedale School of 1923 or whatever year that was, when the classic case of the Gong Lum case. And that's the class picture of the children in that school. And she asked the question, can anyone identify who the number 3 and number 4 girls are in the row at the bottom to the left? As soon as I saw that picture, when I saw Rosedale in 1923, again, bingo, I said, wow, this is powerful, because I had heard about the Gong Lum case and read about it, and I'm sure some of you knew, but I'd never seen pictures of the girls when they were small. And there they are, sitting right in that second row before they got kicked out of the school. So in the spring, they were going to school, I think, and then in the fall, they weren't allowed to come back. So that's, visual evidence that they were actually in the school. And there were several other children there who also looked like they might have been Chinese. So what I wrote on the Facebook thing, I said, this photo is an amazing discovery, Rosedale, 1924. This is the school and the year the Gong Lum case versus Rice case went to the, was brought up and so forth. So that was maybe one of the more dramatic findings, at least for me. That was pretty exciting. And then we have some other just communications among people sharing information about their relatives and sort of thing. So they're trying to help each other, you know, and someone gave information and said, well, thanks for that, but that's not the correct information. So this is networking, and this is so easy to do that, you know, people wouldn't reach out in the past that easily. So this is really a very effective way of instant communication. And there are other things that get posted. Okay, and then you're someone, Carol Ann Golding Wilkerson, who some of you may know. Her grandfather was Reverend Dudley Isaac Jung, who did the Chinese mission at the First Baptist Church in Greenville. And so there's this communication. Francis Wong responds, Raymond Seed responds, Shirley Root. And so people are sharing memories that might not otherwise, you know, offer. Or they're just sweet memories. So Kelly Seed posts a picture of church picnics and so forth. Raymond Seed, who posts lots of cultural things related to the Chinese community, Po Chai, and so everyone who remembers that makes a comment. So it brings back a bonding, even though these people are thousands of miles away from each other. And good old Tiger Balm, everybody remembers that. That's part of every Chinese family. Or just the rich soil of the Delta, you know, showing things that we all remember, you know, from our childhood, the things that we ate, including the chicken feed, and of course, a local cultural institution, an adaptation of China to the Delta. So here's a different type of thing. I got an email or communication through Facebook, and I actually didn't see this for almost a year, but I got this message saying my mother was born in Clarksdale. My aunt said her father spoke Chinese. I believe was also half Chinese due to his mother. He worked at one of the Chinese grocery stores. I believe my mom called it the Bing Li Way. All right, so I see this message like about a year later, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I didn't even know, because I never get messages on Facebook. So, and I saw this, I tried to communicate with this person. Oh, and she said, through your website, I found an interview with Dan Bing, whose father, Joe Bing, owned the store, okay? So, yeah, so, and she wrote, she said, when I read this on my website that I created, she said, I cried because this is the same store where my mother had visited my grandfather, Jesse Lee Cooper, a stalker at Bing Li Way. He also owned a restaurant and so forth. So this was just totally out of the blue. I mean, I didn't expect anything like this to happen. But again, this is something that, you know, the internet brings us a lot closer, maybe sometimes more closer than we want to be. But so I responded back to her, and we had an exchange. She was a student in Santa Monica, California, and everything. So she was looking for her roots, and she thought that this information would be helpful. There's a guy this year in Hong Kong. He's looking for his two aunts. One aunt is Tu Ling Yi, who lived from 1913 to 1998, married Q.W. Chen, and they got married in New York. They came to Greenwood. They had 6 children, and then they left and moved to Queens. The other aunt, this one, she lived until 2008. They also lived in Greenwood. They had 7 children. So some of you might know these people. Anyway, they left and moved to Sacramento. So this guy is asking me to help him find them. So best I can do is post this information, hope that someone out there knows these people. So this is a picture of Curtis Joe Wong. So it's kind of exciting to see the communication and the reaching out and reunion electronically. So one big disadvantage of Facebook is it comes and goes fast. It scrolls. In other words, if you don't look at it today, it's gone, or it's zipped off into hyperspace and you'll probably never see it. So I decided that maybe I should create a website, which is a more, I won't say permanent, but it's a more accessible, searchable thing. And I haven't had time to keep up with it, but I started this hoping that other people would pick up the slack. Peter Joes has been very helpful in sharing information about his family and other things that he knows. So here are just a few the themes that I focus on this website. So one is about Hoover. This is Hoover and Frida Lee's images. They were interviewed in some study probably about 20 years ago. So anyway, race relations obviously is an important issue historically for the Delta Chinese. The website doesn't pretend to be comprehensive. It's just giving samples and illustrations of things that are part of the culture and the lifestyle. And obviously, education is extremely important. So I put in some links to things that are of value and interest historically about education among Chinese in the Delta. And obviously, religion played an extremely important function in the South for Chinese, more so probably than in other parts of the country. So I think it's important to give recognition to that in a way that's more durable than, say, on Facebook. Probably the only thing I left off was football, but you can't have everything. So now we are, in the present, in a sense. And as we know, the Delta community, Chinese community, is fading into, history, or it's no longer there. 3 years ago, Frida Kwan and Blanche Yi, we drove around Greenville looking for old remnants of the Delta community, Chinese community. And this bottom picture is a picture of the Zhou Gaonu No. 2 store. And we went there and we sat at that intersection for like 5 minutes staring at that thing and said, could that possibly be it, And so I took a picture of it and I tried to line it up and see. I'm pretty sure it's exactly the same building, it's empty now. But that's a historic thing, that's one of the last few standing buildings from that era. And some woman, I forget her name, in Alabama, she had a picture of it in color that she sent to me. So as those things disappear into history, it's really more important than ever in the How Joy restaurant, before and after, and it's gone now, okay? It's really important now. It's like now or never. If you don't start recording this stuff, and especially the stories of people's memories and lives, you're not going to be able to get it again. So you better get it while you can. So, so those of you who are more literary minded, may know that there's a famous quote about friends, Romans, countrymen. So the saying there is, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. So I'd have to sort of reverse it in terms of what we're doing here, is that I am trying to do the opposite. I'm coming here to praise the Delta Chinese and not to bury them, although, in a sense, we see that it's really a decaying community. So I think it's important to recognize all the achievements that this community of the Delta Chinese has been able to accomplish, despite really, long odds. It's a pretty amazing story. And when I go around different places and talk about this, people come up to me, they're amazed. They say, we didn't even know there were any Chinese in Mississippi. So I think anytime as an announcement I'm going to talk about Mississippi Chinese, there are a lot of people who come out of curiosity, if nothing else. They just can't believe that you guys were down here. I said, yeah, they were down there. So what we need to do is preserve and honor the past. And we see a lot of this in recent years, like Paul Wong and other people have been involved with the celebration of the Chinese Mission School. Was that last year or the year before? I lose track of time. And that's some great images that you guys took of the marker with the people who grew up in there. And so, I'd end on something that Stan Lyman, who's a professor at Stanford, wrote in 1982, actually. And this was in Rob DeCito Kwan's book. So he talks about, these Chinese were cut off from religious, medical, educational, familial, village, and communal institutions. And then, nonetheless, the Chinese have forged, without these traditional forms of organization, they've made a community, and they focused on the nuclear family and the family-centered grocery store. And they were able to be self-sufficient and had families, and when the women came over and would raise families and so forth. So he kind of concludes, place is always the Delta. Even when people leave the Delta, as many of you have, no matter where you've gone, you're still emotionally, linguistically, and culturally tied to the region of the birth. So this was written in 1982. I think it is very apt, very appropriate, and still very valid. And to paraphrase an old saying, I'll let that speak for itself. I think that's a truism, and I'm really thrilled to be able to participate in this event with you and to help continue working on trying to find out more about your history. Thank you very much. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'll let Emily take over.